Hi, welcome back to Storytime. I am Sunny. If you are returning, welcome back. If you are new, welcome. So, contrary to what the title of the book seems, this is actually a Christmas story, and I have really been looking forward to this for a couple of months now, because I found it when I was searching for Halloween books for the Halloween stream that never happened. So, yeah, it's a contribution between, I believe that Charles Dickens kind of wrote the skeleton of it. He came up with the idea and then had a bunch of his writer friends write the accounts. Oh, hey, Kickin'. Good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. How have you been? How's school been going for you? Hey, John. Oh, I was thinking about you. Have you been? I know that you were. Okay, I will see you in a moment. I was going to try to have some Christmas art here, but I had this candle back there already ready for the Christmas or the Halloween streams, and I thought it was appropriate because Advent, you light the candles. It's a red candle, and it's kind of possibly, hopefully, a spooky story. So we're gonna set Maestro up over here so he's looking at the candle. I like the title. The title of the first chapter. Okay, been good. Oh yeah, really busy. Oh, nice. Oh no. Okay. Well, I hope that you and all your friends are stay safe and healthy. And yeah, and in our high school we had a lot of cases, so they closed down the school for the distance learners. Their schooling wasn't interrupted, but the people who went on campus, they had to switch over to distance learning again. I hope that everything turns out all right with that. And yeah, it's good to see you too. How's your D&D going? You're doing it distance, right? You're doing VOD? Oh, good. I'm glad. It can still be. Oh, hang on a second. Ah, okay. Thank you, Nightbot. And Mod. But yeah, I was hoping to do some Christmas artwork, and I'm still planning on doing that. Hoping to have that up for my wrapping stream. I don't know if I told you about, I'm planning on wrapping all of my presents for my family on stream, so even though I won't have, the webcam still, I will have the microphone, so it'll be a little bit of ASMR, just hanging out with people, playing royalty-free Christmas music, and, stuff like that. So we'll see how that goes. And I already have kind of bare bones for it. Yeah, John, I don't know if you're back, but I was thinking about you this last couple of weeks, because I remember that you had said that you were getting tested, and I hope that came back negative and that you were doing all right. Yeah, anyways, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and I will go ahead, feel free to leave messages in the chat. I will read them between chapters. And yeah, let's make Maestro disappear here. Chapter: The Mortals in the House. Charles, oh, hang on a second. Before I begin, a one-person session down. Oh, hey, Corel, you do still live. I hope it is a manageable existence for you. Ooh, ogre orcs, ogres, orcs, and dragons. Ooh. Oh my goodness, pouch that can hold infinite money. That, ooh, an XP bottle. Is that something you consume and it gives you XP, or something that you can like store XP in? Or it increases XP coming in? Oh, and I don't know if you saw these two up on the right and left top of the screen. I've set some goals because I would like by the new year to have a better mic so I won't have the echoey problem that I've been having. And then the one on the left, that is subs before we get one more emote. So, you know, just trying out the whole goals thing, seeing how that pans out. But yeah, it sounds like you're having fun. I'm glad about that, kicking. All right, for real this time, we're going to go ahead and start. Right. Chapter: The Mortals in the House, Charles Dickens. Under none of the accredited ghostly circumstances and environed by none of the conventional ghostly surroundings did I first make acquaintance with the house, which is the subject of this Christmas piece. I saw it in the daylight, with the sun upon it. There was no wind, no rain, no lightning, no thunder, no awful or unwanted circumstance of any kind to heighten its effect. More than that, I had come to it direct from a railway station. It was not more than a mile distant from the railway station, and as I stood outside the house, looking back upon the way I had come, I could see the goods train running smoothly along the embankment in the valley. I will not say that everything was utterly commonplace, because I doubt if anything could be that except to utterly commonplace people, and there my vanity steps in. But I will take it on myself to say that anybody might see the house as I saw it, any fine autumn morning. The manner of my lighting on it was this. I was traveling towards London out of the north, intending to stop by the way to look at the house. My health required a temporary residence in the country, and a friend of mine who knew that, and who had happened to drive past the house, had written to me to suggest it as a likely place. I had got into the train at midnight, and had fallen asleep, and had woken up, and had sat looking out of the window at the brilliant northern lights in the sky, and had fallen asleep again, and had woke up again to find the night gone, with the usual discontented conviction on me that I hadn't been to sleep at all. Upon which question, in the first imbecility of that condition, I am ashamed to believe that I would have done wager by battle with the man who had sat opposite me. That opposite man had, through the night, as that opposite man always has, several legs too many and all of them too long. In addition to this unreasonable conduct, which was only to be expected of him, he had had a pencil and a pocket-book, and had been perpetually listening and taking notes. It had appeared to me that these aggravating notes related to the jolts and bumps of the carriage, and I should have resigned myself to his taking them, under a general supposition that he was in the civil engineering way of life, if he had not started staring straight over my head whenever he listened. He was a goggle-eyed gentleman of a perplexed aspect, and his demeanor became unbearable. It was a cold, dead morning. The sun had not yet been up, and when I had outwatched the paling light of the fires of the iron country, and the curtain of heavy smoke that hung at once between me and the stars, and between me and the day, I turned to my fellow traveler and said, "I beg your pardon, sir, but do you observe anything particular in me? For really he appeared to be taking down either my travelling cap or my hair with a minuteness that was a liberty. The goggle-eyed gentleman withdrew his eyes from behind me, as if the back of the carriage were 100 miles off, and said, with a lofty look of compassion for my insignificance, "In you, sir? B." "B, sir?" I said, growing warm. "I've nothing to do with you, sir," returned the gentleman. "Pray listen, let me listen." "Oh." He enunciated this vowel after a pause and noted it down. At first I was alarmed, for an express lunatic and no communication with the guard is a serious position. The thought came to my relief that the gentleman might be what is popularly called a rapper, one of a sect of some of whom I have the highest respect, but whom I don't believe in. I was going to ask him the question when he took the bread out of my mouth. "You will excuse me," said the gentleman contemptuously, "if I am too much in advance of common humanity to trouble myself at all about it. I have passed the night, as indeed I pass the whole of my time now, in spiritual intercourse." "Oh," said I, something snappishly. "The conferences of the night began," continued the gentleman, turning several leaves of his notebook, "with this message: evil communications corrupt good manners." "Sound," said I, "but absolutely new?" "New from spirits," returned the gentleman. I could only repeat my rather snappish "oh," and ask if I might be favored with the last communication. "A bird in the hand," said the gentleman, reading his last entry with great solemnity, "is worth 2 in the Bosch." "Truly I am of the same opinion," said I, "but shouldn't it be Bush?" "It came to me Bosch," returned the gentleman. The gentleman then informed me that the spirit of Socrates had delivered this special revelation in the course of the night. "My friend, I hope you are pretty well. There are 2 in this railway carriage. How do you do? There are 17,479 spirits here, but you cannot see them. Pythagoras is here. He is not at liberty to mention it, but hopes you will like traveling. Galileo otherwise had dropped in with his scientific intelligence. I am glad to see you, amico. Come sta? Water will freeze when it is cold enough. Addio." In the course of the night, also, the following phenomena had occurred. Bishop Butler had insisted on spelling his name Bubler, for which offense against orthography and good manners he had been dismissed as out of temper. John Milton, suspected of wilful mystification, had repudiated the authorship of Paradise Lost, and had introduced, as joint authors of that poem, 2 unknown gentlemen, respectively, called Grungers and Skadington, and Prince Arthur, nephew of King John of England, had described himself as tolerably comfortable in the seventh circle, where he was learning to paint on velvet under the direction of Mrs. Trimmer and Mary Queen of Scots. If this should meet the eye of the gentleman who favored me with these disclosures, I trust he will excuse my confessing that the sight of the rising sun and the contemplation of the magnificent order of the vast universe made me impatient of them. In a word, I was so impatient of them that I was mightily glad to get out of at the next station, and to exchange these clouds and vapors for the free air of heaven. By that time, it was a beautiful morning. As I walked away among such leaves as had already fallen from the golden, brown, and russet trees, and as I looked around me on the wonders of creation, and thought of the steady, unchanging, and harmonious laws by which they are sustained, the gentleman's spiritual intercourse seemed to me as poor a piece of journey work as ever this world saw. In which heathen state of mind I came within view of the house, and stopped to examine it attentively. was a solitary house standing in a sadly neglected garden, a pretty even square of some 2 acres. It was a house of about the time of George II, as stiff, as cold, as formal, and in as bad taste as could possibly be desired by the most loyal admirer of the whole quartet of Georges. It was uninhabited, but had, within a year or 2, been cheaply repaired to render it habitable. I say cheaply because the work had been done in a surface manner, and was already decaying as to the paint and plaster, though the colors were fresh. A lopsided board drooped over the garden wall, announcing that it was to let on very reasonable terms, well furnished. It was much too closely and heavily shadowed by trees, and in particular there were 6 tall poplars before the front windows, which were excessively melancholy, and the site of which had been extremely ill chosen. It was easy to see that it was an avoided house, a house that was shunned by the village, to which my eye was guided by a church spire some half a mile off, a house that nobody would take, and the natural inference was that it had the reputation of being a haunted house. No period within the 24 hours of day and night is so solemn to me as the early morning. In the summer-time I often rise very early and repair to my room to do a day's work before breakfast, and I am always on these occasions deeply impressed by the stillness and solitude around me. Besides that, there is something awful in the being surrounded by familiar faces asleep, in the knowledge that those who are dearest to us and to whom we are dearest are profoundly unconscious to us, in an impassive state, anticipative of that mysterious condition to which we are all tending, the stopped life. The broken threads of yesterday, the deserted seats, the closed book, the unfinished but abandoned occupation, all are images of death. The tranquillity of the hour is the tranquillity of death. The color and the chill have the same association, even a certain air that familiar household objects take upon them when they first emerge from the shadows of the night into the morning, of being newer, and as they used to be long ago, has its counterpart in the subsidence of the worn face of maturity or age, in death, into the old youthful look. Moreover, I once saw the apparition of my father at this hour. He was alive and well, and nothing ever came of it, but I saw him in the daylight, sitting with his back towards me, on a seat that stood beside my bed. His head was resting on his hand, and whether he was slumbering or grieving I could not discern. Amazed to see him there, I sat up, moved my position, leaned out of bed, and watched him. As he did not move, I spoke to him more than once. As he did not move then, I became alarmed, and laid my hand upon his shoulder, as I thought, and there was no such thing. For all these reasons, and for others less easily and briefly statable, I find the early morning to be my most ghostly time. Any house would be more or less haunted to me in the early morning, and a haunted house could scarcely address me to greater advantage than that. I walked on into the village with the desertion of that house upon my mind, and I found the landlord of the little inn sanding his doorstep. I bespoke breakfast and broached the subject of the house. "Is it haunted?" I asked. The landlord looked at me, shook his head, and answered, "I say nothing." "Then it is haunted?" "Well," cried the landlord in an outburst of frankness that had the appearance of desperation, "I wouldn't sleep in it." "Why not?" "If I wanted to have all the bells in the house ring with nobody to ring 'em, and all the doors in the house bang with nobody to bang 'em, and all sorts of feet treading upon with no feet there, why then," said the landlord, "I'd sleep in that house." "Is anything there?" The landlord looked at me again, and then, with his former appearance of desperation, called down his stable-yard for "Ikey." The call produced a high-shouldered young fellow with a round red face, a short crop of sandy hair, a very broad, humorous mouth, a turned-up nose, and a great-sleeved waistcoat of purple bars with mother-of-pearl buttons that seemed to be growing upon him, and to be in a fair way, if it were not pruned, of covering his head and overrunning his boots. "This gentleman wants to know," said the landlord, "if anything's seen at the Poplars." "Hooded woman with a howl?" said Ike in a state of great freshness. "Do you mean a cry?" "I mean a bird, sir." "Hooded woman with an owl. Dear me! Did you ever see her?" "Seen the howl." "Never the woman?" "Not so plain as the howl, but they always keeps together." "Has anybody ever seen the woman as plainly as the owl?" "Lord bless you, sir, lots." "Who?" "Lord bless you, sir, lots." "General dealer opposite, for instance, who is opening his shop?" "Perkins? Bless you, Perkins wouldn't go a nigh the place." "No," observed the young man with considerable feeling. "He ain't overwise, ain't Perkins, but he ain't such a fool as that." Here the landlord murmured his confidence in Perkins knowing better. "Who is, or who was, the hooded woman with the owl, do you know?" "Well," said Ike, holding up his cap with one hand while he scratched his head with the other, "they say, in general, that she was murdered, and the owl he hooted the while." This very concise summary of the facts was all I could learn, except that a young man, as hearty and likely a young man as ever I see, had been took with fits and held down in 'em after seeing the hooded woman. Also that a personage dimly described as a old chap, a sort of old one-eyed tramp, answering to the name of Joby, unless you challenged him as Greenwood, and then he'd say, "Why not? And even if so, mind your own business," had encountered the hooded woman, a matter of 5 or 6 times. But I was not materially assisted by these witnesses, inasmuch as the first was in California, and the last was, as Ike said, and he was confirmed by the landlord, anywheres. "Hey, Swags, good to see you. I hope you had a good weekend." Just in the middle of the introductory chapter, which this is Charles Dickens' collaboration. I will reply at the end of the chapter. All right. "Now, although I regard with a hushed and solemn fear the mysteries between which and this state of existence is interposed the barrier of the great trial and change that fall on all the things that live, and although I have not the audacity to pretend that I know anything of them, I can no more reconcile the mere banging of doors, ringing of bells, creaking of boards, and such like insignificances, with the majestic beauty and pervading analogy of all the divine rules that I am permitted to understand, than I had been able, a little while before, to yoke the spiritual intercourse of my fellow traveller to the chariot of the rising sun. Moreover, I had lived in 2 haunted houses, both abroad. In one of these, an old Italian place which bore the reputation of being very badly haunted indeed, and which had recently been twice abandoned on that account, I lived 8 months most tranquilly and pleasantly, notwithstanding that the house had a score of mysterious bedrooms, which were never used, and possessed in one large room, in which I sat reading, times out of the number of all hours, and next to which I slept, a haunted chamber of the first pretensions. I gently hinted these considerations to the landlord, and as to this particular house having a bad name, I reasoned with him. Oh, hang on a second. Oh, 9, you are like 5 away. Oh, okay, now you're 7 away. Well, I'm knocking on wood for you, Swags, and I will really quickly So if you aren't following Swags, Polly Swags, go ahead and give him a follow. He is great, and his swag fam is also really great, and he is very close to his goal. And I hope you reach it soon. I have the utmost faith in you. You're welcome, Swags. Alright, let's see. To cut this part of the story short, hang on a second, just making sure I'm on the right one. Oh, okay, yes. To cut this part of the story short, I was piqued about the haunted house and was already half resolved to take it. So after breakfast, I got the keys from Perkins' brother-in-law, a whip and harness maker who keeps the post office and is under submission to a most rigorous wife of the doubly seceded little Emmanuel persuasion, and went up to the house, attended by my landlord and by Ike. Within, I found it, as I had expected, transcendently dismal. The slowly changing shadows waved on it from the heavy trees were doleful in the last degree. The house was ill-paced, ill-built, ill-planned, and ill-fitted. It was damp. It was not free from dry rot. There was a flavor of rats in it, and it was the gloomy victim of that indescribable decay which settles on all the works of man's hands, whenever it is not turned to man's account. The kitchens and offices were too large and too remote from each other. Above stairs and below, waste tracts of passage intervened between patches of fertility, represented by rooms, and there was a mouldy old well with a green growth upon it hiding like a murderous trap near the bottom of the black stairs under the double row of bells. One of these bells was labeled on a black ground in faded white letters, Master B. This, they told me, was the bell that rang the most. Who was Master B? I asked. Is it known that what he did while the owl hooted? Rang the bell, said Ike. I was rather struck by the prompt dexterity with which this young man pitched his fur cap at the bell and rang it himself. It was a loud, unpleasant bell, and made a very disagreeable sound. The other bells were inscribed according to the names of the rooms to which their wires were conducted, as picture room, double room, clock room, and the like. Following Master B.'s bell to its source, I found that young gentleman to have had but indifferent third-class accommodation in a triangular cabin under the cock-loft, with a corner fireplace which Master B must have been exceedingly small if he were ever to warm himself at, and a corner chimney-piece like a pyramidal staircase to the ceiling for Tom Thumb. The papering of one side of the room had dropped down bodily, with fragments of plaster adhering to it, and almost blocked up the door. It appeared that Master B, in his spiritual condition, always made a point of pulling the paper down. Neither the landlord nor Ike would suggest why he made such a fool of himself. Except that the house had an immensely large rambling loft at top, I made no other discoveries. It was moderately well furnished, but sparingly. Some of the furniture, say a third, was as old as the house. The rest was of various periods within the last half-century. I was referred to a corn chander in the marketplace of the county town to treat for the house. I went that day, and I took it for 6 months. It was just the middle of October when I moved in with my maiden sister. I venture to call her 38. She is so very handsome, sensible, and engaging. We took with us a deaf stableman, my bloodhound Turk, 2 woman servants, and a young person called an odd girl. I have reason to record of the attendant last enumerated, who was one of the St. Lawrence's Union female orphans, that she was a fatal mistake in a disastrous engagement. The year was dying early. The leaves were falling fast. It was a raw, cold day when we took possession, and the gloom of the house was most depressing. The cook, an amiable woman, but of a weak turn of intellect, burst into tears on beholding the kitchen, and requested that her silver watch might be delivered over to her sister, 2 Tuppentock Gardens, Liggs Walk, Clapham Rise, in the event of anything happening to her from the damp. Streaker, the housemaid, feigned cheerfulness, but was the greater martyr. The odd girl, who had never been in the country alone, was pleased and made arrangements for sowing an acorn in the garden outside the scullery window and rearing an oak. We went after dark through all the natural, as opposed to supernatural, miseries incidental to our state. Dispiriting reports ascended, like the smoke, from the basement in volumes, and descended upon the upper rooms. There was no rolling pin. There was no salamander, which failed to surprise me, for I don't know what it is. There was nothing in the house. What there was broken. The last people must have lived like pigs. What could the meaning of the landlord be? Through these distresses, the odd girl was cheerful and exemplary. But within 4 hours after dark we had got into the supernatural groove, and the odd girl had eyes and was in hysterics. My sister and I had agreed to keep the haunting strictly to ourselves, and my impression was, and still is, that I had not left Ikey, when he helped to unload the cart, alone with the women, or any one of them, for any moment. Nevertheless, as I say, the odd girl had seen eyes. No other explanation could ever be drawn from her. Before 9, and by 10 o'clock she had had as much vinegar applied to her as would pickle a handsome salmon. I leave a discerning public to judge of my feelings, when under these untoward circumstances, at about 10:30 o'clock, Master B.'s bell began to ring in a most infuriating manner, and Turk howled until the house resounded with his lamentations. I hope I may never again be in a state of mind so unchristian as the mental frame in which I lived for some weeks respecting the memory of Master B. Whether his bell was rung by rats or mice or bats or wind or what other accidental vibration, or sometimes by one cause, sometimes another, and sometimes by collusion, I don't know, but certainly it is that it did ring 2 nights out of 3 until I conceived the happy idea of twisting Master B.'s neck, in other words, breaking his bell short off, and silencing that young gentleman, as to my experience and belief, forever. But by that time the odd girl had developed such improving powers of catalepsy that she had become a shining example of that very inconvenient disorder. She would stiffen like a Guy Fawkes endowed with unreason on the most irrelevant occasions. I would address the servants in a lucid manner, pointing out to them that I had painted Master B.'s room, and balked the paper, and taken Master B.'s bell away, and balked the ringing, and if they could suppose that that confounded boy had lived and died to clothe himself no better behavior than would most unquestionably have brought him and the sharpest particles of a birch broom into close acquaintance in the present imperfect state of existence, could they also suppose a mere poor human being, such as I was, capable by those contemptible means of counteracting and limiting the powers of the disembodied spirit of the dead, or of any spirits? I say I would become emphatic and cogent, not to say rather complacent, in such an address, when it would all go for nothing by reason of the odd girl suddenly stiffening from the toes upward and glaring among us like a parochial petrification. Streaker, the housemaid, too, had an attribute of a most discomfiting nature. I am unable to say whether she was of any unusually lymphatic temperament, or what else was the matter with her, but this young woman became a mere distillery for the production of the largest and most transparent tears I ever met with. Combined with these characteristics was a peculiar tenacity of hold in those specimens, so that they didn't fall, but hung upon her face and nose. In this condition, and mildly and deploringly shaking her head, her silence would throw me more heavily than the admirable Crichton could have done in a verbal disputation for a purse of money. Cook otherwise always comforted me with confusion as with a garment, by neatly winding up the session with the protest that the house was wearing her out, and by meekly repeating her last wishes regarding her silver watch. As to our nightly life, the contagion of suspicion and fear was among us, and there is no such contagion under the sky. Hooded woman? According to the accounts, we were in a perfect convent of hooded women. Noises? With that contagion downstairs, I myself have sat in the dismal parlor listening until I have heard so many and such strange noises that they would have chilled my blood if I had not warmed it by dashing out to make discoveries. Try this in bed, in the dead of night. Try this at your own comfortable fireside, in the life of the night. You can fill any house with noises if you will, until you have a noise for every nerve in your nervous system. I repeat, the contagion of suspicion and fear was among us, and there is no such contagion under sky. The women, their noises in chronic state of excoriation, that's a word, interesting, from smelling salts, were always primed and loaded for a swoon and ready to go off with hair triggers. The two elder detached the odd girl on all expeditions that were considered doubly hazardous, and she always established the reputation of such adventures by coming back cataleptic. If Cook or Streaker went overhead after dark, we knew we should presently hear a bump on the ceiling, and this took place so constantly that it was as if a fighting man were engaged to go about the house, administering a touch of his art, which I believe is called the auctioneer, to every domestic he met with. It was in vain to do anything. It was in vain to be frightened, for the moment in one's own person by a real owl, and then to show the owl. It was in vain to discover, by striking an accidental discord on the piano, the Turk always howled at particular notes and combinations. It was in vain to be a Rhadamanthus with the bells, and if an unfortunate bell rang without leave, to have it done inexorably and silence it. It was in vain to fire up chimneys, let torches down the wall, charge furiously into suspected rooms and recesses. We changed servants, and it was no better. The new set ran away, and a third set came, and it was no better. At last our comfortable housekeeping got to be so disorganized and wretched that I one night dejectedly said to my sister, "Patty, I begin to despair of our getting people to go on with us here. I think we must give this up." My sister, who was a woman of immense spirit, replied, "No, John, don't give it up. Don't be beaten, John. There's another way." "And what is that?" I said. "John," returned my sister, if we are not to be driven out of this house, and that is for no reason whatever, that is apparent to you or me, we must help ourselves and take the house wholly and solely into our own hands." "But the servants," said I. "Have no servants," said my sister boldly. What a concept, people! Like most people in my grade of life, I had never thought of the possibility of going on without those faithful obstructions. The notion was so new to me when suggested that I looked very doubtful. We know they come here to be frightened and infect one another, and we know they are frightened and do infect one another, said my sister. With the exception of Bottles, I observed in a meditative tone. The deaf stableman. I kept him in my service, and still keep him, as a phenomenon of moroseness not to be matched in England. To be sure, John, assented my sister, except Bottles. And what does that go to prove? Bottles talks to nobody, and hears nobody unless he is absolutely roared at. And what alarm has Bottles ever given or taken? None. This was perfectly true. The individual in question having retired every night at 10 o'clock to his bed over the coach-house with no other company than a pitchfork and a pail of water. That the pail of water would have been over me, and the pitchfork through me, if I had put myself without announcement in Bottles' way after that minute, I have deposited in my own mind as a fact of worth remembering. Neither had Bottles ever taken the least notice of any of our many uproars. An imperturbable and speechless man, he had sat at his supper, with Streaker present in a swoon, and the odd girl Marble, and had only put another potato in his cheek, or profited by the general misery to help himself to beefsteak pie. And so, continued my sister, I exempt Bottles, and considering, John, that the house is too large and perhaps too lonely to be kept well in hand by Bottles, you and me, I propose that we cast about among our friends for a certain selected number of the most reliable and willing. Form a society here for 3 months, wait upon ourselves and one another, live cheerfully and socially, and see what happens. I was so charmed with my sister that I embraced her on the spot, and went into her plan with the greatest ardor. We were then in the 3rd week of November, but we took our measures so vigorously, and were so well seconded by the friends in whom we confided, that there was still a week of the month unexpired, when our party all came down together merrily, and mustered in the haunted house. I will mention in this place 2 small changes that I made while my sister and I were yet alone. It occurred to me as not improbable that Turk howled in the house at night, partly because he wanted to get out of it. I stationed him in his kennel outside, but unchained, and I seriously warned the village that any man who came in his way must not expect to leave him without a rip to his own throat. I then casually asked Ike if he were a judge of a gun. On his saying, "Yes, sir, I knows a gun when I sees her," I begged the favor of his stepping up to the house and looking at mine. "She's a true one, sir," said Ike, after inspecting a double-barreled rifle that I bought in New York a few years ago. "No mistake about her, sir." "Ike," said I, "don't mention it. I have seen something in this house." "No, sir," he whispered, greedily opening his eyes. "Who did lady, sir?" "Don't be frightened," said I. "It was a figure rather like you." "Lord, sir!" "Ike," said I, shaking hands with him warmly, I may say affectionately, "if there is any truth in these ghost stories, the greatest service I can do you is to fire at that figure, and I promise you, by heaven and earth, I will do it with a gun if I see it again." The young man thanked me and took his leave with some little precipitation, after declining a glass of liquor. I imparted my secret to him because I had never quite forgotten his throwing his cap at the bell, because I had, on another occasion, noticed something very like a fur cap lying not far from the bell one night when it had burst out ringing, and because I had remarked that we were at our ghostliest whenever he came up in the evening to comfort the servants. Let me do Ike no injustice. He was afraid of the house and believed in its being haunted, and yet he would play false in the haunting side so surely as he got an opportunity. The odd girl's case was exactly similar. She went about the house in a real state of terror, and yet lied monstrously and wilfully, and invented many of the alarms she spread, and made many of the sounds we heard. I had had my eye on the two, and I know it. It is not necessary for me here to account for this preposterous state of mind. I content myself with remarking that it is familiarly known to every intelligent man who has had fair medical, legal, or other watchful experience, that it is as well established and as common a state of mind as any with which observers are acquainted, and that it is one of the first elements, above all others, rationally to be suspected in, and strictly looking for, and separated from, any question of this kind. To return to our party, the first thing we did when we were all assembled was to draw lots for bedrooms. That done, in every bedroom, and indeed the whole house, having been minutely examined by the whole body, we allotted the various household duties, as if we had been on a gypsy party, or a yachting party, or a hunting party, or were shipwrecked. I then recounted the floating rumors concerning the hooded lady, the owl, and Master B., with others still more flimsy, which had floated about during our occupation, relative to some ridiculous old ghosts of the female gender who went up and down, carrying the ghost of a round table, and also to an impalpable jackass, whom nobody was ever able to catch. Some of these ideas I really believed our people below had communicated to one another in some diseased way, without conveying them in words. We then gravely called one another to witness that we were not there to be deceived, or to deceive, which we considered pretty much the same thing, and that, with a serious sense of responsibility, we would be strictly true to one another, and would strictly follow out the truth. The understanding was established that any one who heard unusual noises in the night, and who wished to trace them, should knock at my door. Lastly, that on Twelfth Night, the last night of Holy Christmas. All our individual experiences since that then present hour of our coming together in the haunted house, should be brought to light for the good of all, and that we would hold our peace on the subject till then, unless on some remarkable provocation to break silence. We were in number and in character as follows. First, to get my sister and myself out of the way, there were we two. In the drawing of lots, my sister drew her own room, and I drew Master B.'s. Next, there was our first cousin, John Herschel, so called after the great astronomer, than whom I suppose a better man at a telescope does not breathe. With him as his wife, was his wife, a charming creature to whom he had been married in the previous spring. I thought it, under the circumstances, rather imprudent to bring her, because there is no knowing what even a false alarm may do at such a time, but I suppose he knew his own business best, and I must say that if she had been my wife, I never could have left her endearing and bright face behind. They drew the clock-room. Alfred Starling, an uncommonly agreeable young fellow of 28, for whom I have the greatest liking, was in the double room, mine usually, and designated by that name from having a dressing-room within it, with two large and cumbersome windows, which no wedges I was ever able to make would keep from shaking in any weather, wind or no wind. Alfred is a young fellow who pretends to be fast, another word for loose, as I understand the term, but who is much too good and sensible for that nonsense, and who would have distinguished himself before now if his father had not unfortunately left him a small independence of 200 a year, on the strength of which his only occupation in life has been to spend 6. I am in hopes, however, that his banker may break, or that he may enter into some speculation guaranteed to pay 20%, for I am convinced that if he could not be ruined, his fortune is made. Belinda Bates, bosom friend of my sister, and a most intellectual, amiable, and delightful girl, got the picture room. She was a fine genius for poetry, combined with real business earnestness, and goes in, to use an expression of Alfred's, for women's missions. Women's rights, women's wrongs, and everything that is women's with a capital W, or is not and ought to be, or is and ought not to be. Most praiseworthy, my dear, and heaven prosper you, I whispered to her on the first night of my taking leave of her at the picture-room door. But don't overdo it, and in respect of the great necessity there is, my darling, for more employment being within the reach of women than our civilization has yet assigned to her, don't fly at the unfortunate men, even those men who are at first sight in your way, as if they were the natural oppressors of your sex. For trust me, Belinda, they do sometimes spend their wages among wives and daughters, sisters, mothers, aunts, and grandmothers, and the play is really not all Wolf and Red Riding Hood, but has other parts in it. However, I digress. Belinda, as I have mentioned, occupied the picture room. We had but 3 other chambers, the corner room, the cupboard room, and the garden room. My old friend, Jack Governor, slung his hammock, as he called it, in the corner room. I have always regarded Jack as the finest-looking sailor that ever sailed. He is gray now, but as handsome as he was a quarter of a century ago, nay, handsomer. A portly, cheery, well-built figure of a broad-shouldered man, with a frank smile, a brilliant dark eye, and a rich dark eyebrow. I remember those under darker hair, and they looked all the better for their silver setting. He has been wherever his Union namesake flies, has Jack, and I have met old shipmates of his, away in the Mediterranean and on the other side of the Atlantic, who have beamed and brightened at the casual mention of his name, and have cried, "You know Jack Governor? And you know a prince of men." That he is, and so unmistakably a naval officer that if you were to meet him coming out of an Eskimo, they spell Eskimo differently, Esquimaux is a new spelling, isn't it? That if you were to meet him coming out of an Eskimo snow hut in seal skin, you would be vaguely persuaded he was in full naval uniform. Jack once had that bright, clear eye of his on my sister, but it fell out that he married another lady and took her to South America, where she died. This is a dozen years ago or more. He brought down with him to our haunted house a little cask of salt beef, for he is always convinced that all salt beef, not of his own picking, is mere carrion, and invariably, when he goes to London, packs a piece in his portmanteau. He had also volunteered to bring with him one Nat Beaver, an old comrade of his, captain of a merchantman. Mr. Beaver, with a thick-set wooden face and figure, and apparently as hard as a block all over, proved to be an intelligent man, with a world of watery experiences in him, and great practical knowledge. At times there was a curious nervousness about him, apparently the lingering result of some old illness, but it seldom lasts many minutes. He got the cupboard room, and lay there next to Mr. Undery, my friend and solicitor, who came down in an amateur capacity to go through with it, as he said, and who plays whist better than the whole law list, from the red cover at the beginning to the red cover at the end. I never was happier in my life, and I believed it was the universal feeling among us. Jack Governor, always a man of wonderful resources, was chief cook, and made some of the best dishes I ever ate, including unapproachable curries. My sister was pastry cook and confectioner. Starling and I were cook's mate, turn and turn about, and on special occasions the chief cook pressed Mr. Beaver. He had a great deal of outdoor sports and exercise, but nothing was neglected within, and there was no ill humor or misunderstanding among us, and our evenings were so delightful that we had at last one good reason for being reluctant to go to bed. At least one good reason. We had a few nights' alarms in the beginning. On the first night, I was knocked up by On the first night, I was knocked up by Jack with a most wonderful ship's lantern in his hand, like the gills of some monster of the deep, who informed me that he was going aloft to the main truck to have the weathercock down. I think knocking up means that they were awakened by somebody knocking at the door, or somebody knocked at their door while they were in it, or something. I don't know. That's my assumption. Very different from our current meaning of the word. Let's see, where was I? It was a stormy night, and I remonstrated, but Jack called my attention to its making a sound like a cry of despair, and said somebody would be hailing a ghost presently if it wasn't done. So up to the top of the house, where I could hardly stand for the wind, we went, accompanied by Mr. Beaver, and there Jack, lantern and all, with Mr. Beaver after him, swarmed up to the top of a cupola, some 24 feet above the chimneys, and stood upon nothing particular, coolly knocking the weathercock off, until they both got into such good spirits with the wind and the height, that I thought they would never come down. Another night they turned out again, and had a chimney cowl off. Another night they cut a sobbing and gulping water pipe away. Another night they found out something else. On several occasions they both, in the coolest manner, simultaneously dropped out of their respective bedroom windows, hand over hand by their counterpanes, to overhaul something mysterious in the garden. The engagement among us was faithfully kept, and nobody revealed anything. All we knew was, if any one's room was haunted, no one looked the worse for it. Christmas came, and we had noble Christmas fare. All hands had been pressed for the pudding, and 12th night came, and our store of mincemeat was ample to hold out to the last day of our time, and our cake was quite a glorious sight. It was then, as we all sat round the table and the fire, that I recited the terms of our compact, and called first for... Yes, that is how he ended the chapter. Just going to take a quick moment. I see you guys are like bartering for services there. Corel is a wonderful mod. I have much gratitude towards him. Corel the agency. All right. Chapter: The Ghost in the Clock Room by Hesba Stretton. My cousin, John Herschel, turned rather red and turned rather white, and said he could not deny that his room had been haunted. The spirit of a woman had pervaded it. On being asked by several voices whether the spirit had taken any terrible or ugly shape, my cousin drew his wife's arm through his own, and said decidedly, "No." To the question that had his wife been aware of the spirit, he answered, "Yes." Had it spoken? "Oh dear, yes." As to the question, what did it say, he replied apologetically that he could have wished his wife would have understood the answer, for she would have executed it much better than he. However, she had made him promise to be the mouthpiece of the spirit, and was very anxious that he should withhold nothing, so he would do his best, subject to her correction. "Suppose the spirit," added my cousin, as he finally prepared himself for beginning, "to be my wife here, sitting among us." Ooh, steak dinner. I haven't had steak in a while. I gotta miss it. We have a really good steakhouse here. Well, not really, really good, but it's good. And it's called the Willow. And you do have the option of cooking your own steak there. I was an orphan from my infancy, with 6 elder half-sisters, a long and persistent course of training imposed upon me, the yoke of a second and diverse nature, and I grew up as much the child of my eldest sister, Barbara, as I was the daughter of my deceased parents. Barbara, in all her private plans, as in all the domestic decrees, inexorably decided that her sisters must be married, and so powerful had been her single but inflexible will that each of them had been advantageously settled, excepting myself, upon whom she built her highest hopes. Most people I know, a character such as I had grown, a mindless, flirting girl who acknowledged vocation was the hunting and catching of an edible match, rather pretty, living and first sentimental enough to make me a very pleasant companion for an idle hour or two, as I exacted and enjoyed the slight attentions an unemployed man is pleased to offer. There was scarcely a young man in the neighborhood with whom I had not coquetted. I had served my 7 years' apprenticeship to my profession, and had passed my 25th birthday without having achieved my purposes, when Barbara's patience was wearied, and she spoke to me with a decision and explicitness we had always avoided, for on some subjects it is better to have a silent understanding than an expressed opinion. "Stella," she said solemnly, "you are now 25, and every one of your sisters were in homes of their own before they were your age, yet none of them had your advantages or your talents. But I must tell you frankly, your chances are on the wane, and unless you exert yourself, our plans must fail. I have observed an error into which you have fallen, and which I have not mentioned before. Besides your very own and indiscriminate flirtations, which young men regard only as an amusing pastime, you have a way with you of rallying and laughing at any one who begins to look really serious. Now your opportunity rests upon the moment when they begin to be in earnest their manner. Then you should seem confused and silent, and you ought to lose your vivacity and half avoid them, seeming almost frightened and quite bewildered by the change. A little melancholy goes a deal further than the utmost cheerfulness, for if a man believes you can live without him, he will not give you a second thought. I could name 6 most eligible settlements you have lost by laughing at the wrong minute. Mortify a man's self-love, Stella, and you can never heal the wound." I paused for a minute or two before I answered, for the original suppressed nature that I had inherited from my own unknown mother was stirring unwonted feelings in my heart. "Barbara," I answered timidly, "among all the people I have known, I never saw one whom I could reverence and look up to, nor I am half ashamed to use the word, whom I could love." "I do not wonder you are ashamed," said Barbara severely. "At your age you cannot expect to fall in love like a girl of 17, but I tell you definitely and distinctly it is necessary that you should marry, and we had better work on a concert now. So, if you will decide upon on any one, I will give you every assistance in my power, and if you will only concentrate your wishes and abilities, you cannot fail. Propinquity is all you require, if you once made up your mind." "I do not like anyone I know," I replied moodily, "and I have no chance with those who have known me, so I decide upon besieging Martin Fraser." Barbara received this announcement with a snort of derisive anger. The neighborhood in which we lived was a populous iron district where, Though there were few families of ancient birth or high standing, there were many of our own station, forming a pleasant, hospitable social class. Our residences were commodious modern houses, built at convenient distances from each other. Some of these, including our own, were the property of an infirm old man who dwelt in his family mansion, the last of the many gabled, half-timbered Elizabethan houses which had stood upon the undiscovered iron and coal fields. The last relics of the rural aristocracy of the district, Mr. Fraser and his son led a strictly recluse life, avoiding all communications with their neighbors, whose gaiety and hospitality they could not reciprocate. No one intruded upon their privacy excepting for the most necessary business transactions. The elder man was almost bedridden, and the younger was said to be entirely absorbed in scientific pursuits. No wonder that Barbara had laughed, for her ridicule only excited and confirmed my determination, and the very difficulty of the enterprise gave it the interest that all my other efforts had lacked. I argued obstinately with Barbara till I won her consent. "You must write to old Mr. Fraser," I said. "Do not mention the young one, and say your youngest sister is studying astronomy, and, as he possesses the only telescope in the country, you will be greatly indebted to him if he will let me see it." "There is one thing in your favor," Barbara remarked as she sat down to write. "The old gentleman was once engaged to your mother." Oh, I am humbled to think how shrewdly we managed our business, and extorted a kind invitation from Mr. Fraser to the daughter of his old friend, Maria Horley. It was an evening in February, when, accompanied only by an old servant, for Barbara was not included in the invitation, I first crossed the threshold of Martin Fraser's home. An air of profound peace pervaded the dwelling. I entered it with a vague, uneasy consciousness of unfitness and treachery. My attendant remained in the entrance hall, and, as I was conducted to the library, a feeling of shyness stole over me, which was prompting me to retreat. But, with the recollection that I was becoming dressed, I regained my confidence, and advanced smilingly into the room, becomingly dressed. It was a low, oaken-panelled room, sombre, with massive antique furniture that threw deep and curious shadows around, in the flickering light of a fire by which stood, instead of the recluse, Martin Fraser, whom I expected to meet, a quaint little child dressed in the garb of a woman, and with a woman's self-possession and ease of manner. "I am very glad to see you. You are welcome," she said, advancing to meet me, extending her hand to lead me to a seat. She clasped my hand with a firm and peculiar grasp, a clasp of guidance and assistance, quite unlike the ordinary timidity or inertness of a child's manner, and, placing me in a chair before the fire, she seated herself nearly opposite me. I made a few embarrassing remarks, to which she replied, and then I noticed her furtively and in silence. A huge black retriever lay motionless at her feet, which rested upon him, covered with the fields of the long robe-like dress she wore. There was an expression of placidity, slightly pensive, upon her tiny features, heightened by a peculiar habit of closing the eyes, which is rarely seen in children, and always gives them a statuesque appearance. It seemed as though she had withdrawn herself into a solitary self-communing, of which there could be no expression, either by words or looks. I grew afraid of that silent, weird-like creature, sitting without apparent breath or motion in the dancing firelight, and I was glad when the door opened and the object of my pursuit entered. I looked at him inquisitively, for I had recovered from my senses of treachery, and it amused me to think how unconscious he was of our definite plans concerning him. Hitherto the young man I had met had the fear of being caught, greater than any desire to catch them, So our contest wasn't, has been an open and equal one, but Martin Fraser knew nothing of the wiles of a woman. I remember that my brown hair fell in curls round my face, and that my dark blue eyes were considered expressive when I looked up to meet his gaze. But when he accosted me with an air of grave preoccupation and of courteous indifference that would not permit him to notice my personal charms, I trembled to think that all I knew of astronomy was what I had learned at the school at Magnol's Questions. The grave, austere man said at once, "My father, Mr. Fraser, was altogether confined to his own room, but he desires the favour of a visit from you. Upon me devolves the honour of showing you what you require to view through the telescope, and while I adjust it, will you oblige him by conversing with him for a few minutes? Lucy Fraser will accompany you." The child rose, and, taking my hand again in her firm hold, led me to the old man's sitting room. "You are like your mother, child," he said, after looking at me long. "You are like your mother, child," he said, after looking at me long. "You have a face and eyes, not a whit like your sister Barbara. How did you come by your out-of-the-way name, Stella?" "My father named me after a favorite racer," I answered, for the first time giving the simple derivation of my name. "Just like him," laughed the old man. "I remember the horse well. I knew your father as well as I do my son Martin. You have seen my son, young lady?" "Yes, I thought so. And this is my granddaughter, Lucy Fraser, the last chip of the old block, for my son is not a marrying man, and we have adopted her as our heir. She is always to keep her name and be the founder of another line of Frasers." The child stood with pensive, downcast eyes, as though already bowed down by the weight of cares and responsibilities. The old man chatted on, till the deep tones of an organ resounded through the house. "My uncle is ready for us," she said to me. We paused at the library door, for I laid my hand restrainingly on Lucy Fraser's shoulder and stood listening to the wonderful music the organ poured forth. It was such as I had never heard before, roaring and swelling like the ceaseless surging of the sea, and here and there a single wailing note which seemed to pierce me with an inexpressible pain. When it had ended, I stood before Martin Fraser, silent and subdued. The telescope had been carried out to the end of the terrace, where the house could not intercept our view, and thither Lucy Fraser and I followed the astronomer. We stood upon the highest point of an imperceptibly rising tableland, the horizon of which was from 20 to 40 miles distant. An infinite dome of sky was expanded above us, an ocean of firmament, of which the dwellers among houses and mountains can have but little conception. The troops of glittering stars, the dark, shrouding night, the unaccustomed voices of my companions deepened the awe that oppressed me. And as I stood between them, I became as earnest and occupied as themselves. I forgot everything but the incomprehensible grandeur of the universe revealed to me, and the majestic sweep of the planets across the field of the telescope. What a freshness of awe and delight came over me! What floods of thought came, wave upon wave, across my mind, and how insignificant I felt before this wilderness of worlds! I asked for the humility of a child, for all affection had been charmed away, if I might come again soon. Martin Fraser met my uplifted eyes with a keen and penetrating look. I did not quail under it, for I was thinking only of the stars. As he looked, his mouth relaxed into a pleased and genial smile. "We shall always be glad to see you," he replied. Barbara was sitting up for me when I returned, and was about to address me with some worldly speculative remark when I interrupted her quickly. "Not one word, Barbara, not one question, or I never go near the Holmes again." I cannot dwell upon details. I went often to the house. Into the dull routine of Mr. Fraser's and Lucy's life I came, I suppose, like a streak of sunshine lighting up the cloud that had been creeping over them. To both I thought brought wholesome excitement and merriment, and so I became dear and necessary to them. But over myself there came a great and an almost indescribable change. I had been frivolous, self-seeking, soulless, but the solemn study I had begun with other studies that came in its train awoke me from my inanity to a life of mental activity. I absolutely forgot my purpose, for I had at once perceived that Martin Fraser was as distant and as self-poised as the polar star. So I became to him merely a diligent and insatiable pupil, and he was to me only a grave and exacting master, to be propitiated by most profound reverence. Each time I crossed the threshold of his quiet home, all the worldliness and coquetry of my nature fell from my soul like an unfit garment, and I entered as into a temple, simple, real, and worshipping. The happy summer passed away, the autumn crept on, and for 8 months I had visited the Frasers constantly, and had never, by word or look or tone, intentionally deceived them. Lucy Fraser and I had long looked forward to an eclipse of the moon, which was visible only in October. I left my home alone in the twilight of that evening, my thoughts dwelling upon the coming pleasure, when, just as I drew near the Holmes, there overtook me one of the young men with whom I had flirted in former times. "Good evening, Stella," he exclaimed familiarly. "I have not seen you for a long time. Ah, you are pursuing other game, I suppose, but are you not aiming rather too high this time? Well, you're in luck just now, for if Martin Fraser does not come forward, there is George York, just come home from Australia with an immense fortune, and he's longing to remind you of some tender passages between you before he went out. He was showing us a lock of your hair after dinner at the Crown yesterday." I listened to this speech with no outward demonstration, but the reality and mortification of my degradation was gnawing me, and, hastening onward to my sanctuary, I sought the presence of my little Lucy Fraser. "I have done wrong today," she said. "I have been deceitful. I think I ought to tell you that you may not think too well of me, but I want you to love me as much as ever. I have not told a story, but I have acted one." Lucy Fraser leaned her tiny brow upon her tiny fingers, and her eyes closed in silent self-reading. "My uncle says," she continued, looking up for a moment, and blushing like a woman, "that women are perhaps less truthful than men, because they cannot do things by strength, they do them by cunning. They live falsely. They deceive their own selves. Sometimes women deceive for amusement. He has taught me some words which I shall understand better some day. To thine own self be true, and it will follow as the night the day. Thou canst not be false to any man." I stood before the child, abashed and speechless, listening with burning cheeks. "Grandpapa showed me a verse in the Bible which is awful to me. Listen. I find more bitter than death the woman whose heart is snares and nets, and her hands as bands. Whoso pleaseth God shall escape from her, but the sinner shall be taken by her." I hid my face in my hands, though no eye was on me, for Lucy Fraser had veiled hers with her tremulous lids, and, as I stood confounded and self-accused, a hand was laid upon my arm, and Martin Fraser's voice said, "The eclipse, Stella." I started at this first utterance of my name, which had never
he had never spoken before. I was completely unnerved when I found that Lucy Fraser was not to accompany us on the terrace. As Martin Fraser stooped to see if the telescope were rightly adjusted for my use, I shrank from him. "What is the meaning of this, Stella?" he exclaimed as I burst into tears. "Shall I speak to you now, Stella?" he said, "while there is yet time before you leave us. Does your heart cling to us as our hearts cling to you till we dare not think of the void there will be in our home when you are gone? We did not live before we knew you. You are our health and our life. I have noted you as I never watched a woman before, and I find no fault in you, my pearl, my jewel, my star. You are our, hang on a second. Hitherto, woman and deceit have been inseparably conjoined in my mind, but your innocent heart is the home of truth. I know you have had no thought of this, and my vehemence alarms you, but tell me plainly if you can love me." He had taken me in his arms, and my head rested against his strongly throbbing heart. His sternness and austerity were gone, and he offered me the undiminished wealth of a love that had not been wasted in fickle likings. My success was perfect, and how gladly would I have remained there till my silence had grown eloquent. But Barbara rose to my memory, and Lucy Fraser's words still tinkled in my ears. The black shadow eating away the heart of the moon seemed, hang on a second, what was that word? Seemed to pause in its measured motion. All heaven looked down upon us through those solemn stars. The rustling leaves were hushed, and the scented autumn breeze ceased for a minute. A cloud of truth-compelling witnesses echoed the cry of my awkward conscience. I withdrew myself, sad and shame-stricken. "Martin Fraser," I said, "your words constrain me to be true. I am the falsest woman you ever met. I came here with the sole definite intention of attracting you, and if you had ever gone out into your circle, you would have heard of me only as a flirt, a heartless coquette. I dare not bring falsehood to your fireside, and the bitterness of death to your heart. Do not speak to me now. Have patience, and I will write to you." He would have detained me, but I sprang away, and running swiftly down the avenue, I passed out of my Eden with the sentence of perpetual banishment in my heart. The eclipse was at the full, and a horror of darkness and dismay engulfed me as I stood shivering and sobbing under the restless poplars. Barbara met me as I hastened to hide myself in my own room, and, with her cold, glittering eyes fixed inquiringly on me, said, "Well, what's the matter with you?" "Nothing," I answered. "Only I am tired of astronomy, and I shall not go to the Holmes again. It is of no use." "I always said so," she replied. "However, to bring matters to a crisis, I gave Mr. Fraser notice we should leave at Christmas. Then you are satisfied that it would be a waste of time to continue going there?" "Quite," I said, and passed on to my room to learn, through the weary hours of the night, what desolation and hopelessness meant. The next day I wrote to Martin Fraser, in every word sacred truth, expecting that, self-deceived, and with a false pride even in my utter humiliation, I told him I had not loved, and did not love him. The first object upon which my eyes rested every joyless morning were the tall poplar trees waving round his house and beckoning maddeningly to me. The last thing I saw at night was the steady light in his library, shining like a star among the laurels. But him I could never see, for my letter had been too explicit to suggest a hope, and I could not, for shame, attempt to meet him in his walks. All that remained for me was to return to my former life, if I could by any means feed my hungering and fainting soul with the husks that had once satisfied me. George York renewed his addresses to me, offering me wealth beyond our expectations. It was a sole temptation, for before me lay a monotonous and fretted life with Barbara, and a solitary, uncared-for old age. Why could not I live as thousands of other women who were not unhappy wives? But I remembered a passage I had read in one of Martin's books. It is not always our duty to marry. It is always our duty to abide by right, not to purchase happiness by loss of honor, not to avoid unweddedness by untruthfulness. And, setting my face steadily to meet the bleakness and bareness of my lot, I rejected the proposal. Barbara was terribly exasperated, and very miserable we both were, until she accepted an invitation to spend the Christmas with one of her sisters, while I was left with my old nurse to superintend the moving of the furniture. I wished to linger in our old home till the last moment, and I was glad to be alone on Christmas Day, in the deserted house, that, in solitude, I might make my mental record of all of its associations and remembrances, before the place knew me no more. So, on Christmas Eve, I wandered through the empty rooms, not more empty than my heart, which was being dismantled of its old memories and newer but deeper tendernesses, until I paused mechanically before the window, whence I had often looked across to the homes. The air had been dense and murky all day, with thickly falling snow, but the storm was over, and the moonless sky bright with stars, while the glittering snow reflected light enough to show me where stood, like a dark mass against the sky, the house of Martin Fraser. His room was dark, as it had been for many nights before, but old Mr. Fraser's window, which was nearer to our house, emitted a brilliant light across the white lawn. I was exhausted with overwork and overexcitement, and leaned there, pressing my heated cheek against the frosty pane. I rehearsed to myself all the incidents of my intercourse with them, and there followed through my mind, picture after picture, dream within dream, visions of the happiness that might have been mine. As I stood thus, with tears stealing through the clasped hands that covered my eyes, my nurse came in to close the shutters. She started nervously when she saw me. "I thought you were your mother," she exclaimed. I have seen her stand just so, hundreds of times. "Susan, how was it that my mother did not marry Mr. Fraser?" "Oh, they were like other people, didn't understand one another much as they were in love," she answered. "Mr. Fraser's first marriage had been for money and was not a happy one, so he had grown something stern. They quarreled, and your mother was provoked to marry Mr. Breton, your father. Well, Mr. Fraser became an old man all at once, and scarcely ever left his own house, so that she never saw him again, nor as he lived, though I have often seen her, when your father was off to balls or races or public meetings, standing here just as you stood now. Only the last time you were in her arms, she was leaning against this window when I brought you in to say good night, and she whispered softly, looking up to the heaven, 'I have tried to do my duty to my husband and to my little child.' 'Nurse,' I said, 'leave me. Do not shut the window yet.' It was no longer a self-emotion that possessed me. I had been murmuring that there was no sorrow like my sorrow, but my mother's error had been graver, and her trials deeper than mine. The burden she had borne had weighed down had weighed her down into an early grave, but it had not passed away from earth with her. It rested now, heavily augmented by her death, upon the hearth of the aged man, who, doubtless, in his contemplative time, was reviewing the events of his past life, and this chiefly because it had mourned my mother's, death, and this chiefly because it was the saddest of them all. I longed to see him once again, to see him who had mourned my mother's death more bitterly and lastingly than any other being, and I determined to steal secretly across the fields and up the avenue, and if his window were uncurtained and its brightness suggested, to look upon him once more in remembrance of my mother. I hesitated upon our doorstep, as though my mother and myself were both concerned in some doubtless enterprise. Sorry about the motorcycle out there. I don't know what they're doing. Let's see. I hesitated upon our doorstep, as though my mother and myself were both concerned in some doubtful enterprise, but with the hardihood of my nature, I drove away the scruple and passed on into the frosty night. Yes, the window was uncurtained. I could tell that at the avenue gate, and I could see him, whom my mother loved, lying alone and uncheered upon his couch, as he would lie now all his weary years through, until Lucy Fraser was old enough to be a daughter to him. And then I remembered a rumor that the old man's grandchild was dying, which Susan had told me sorrowfully an hour or two ago, and, growing bewildered, I ran on swiftly until I stood before the window. It was no longer an invalid's room. The couch was gone and the sheltering screen, and Lucy's little chair within it. Neither were there any appliances or modern luxury or wealth, no softness, no coloring, no gorgeousness. It was simply the library and workroom of a busy student who was forgetful and neglectful of comfort. Yet, such as it was, my heart recognized it as home. There Martin sat, deep, as was his wont, in complicated calculations and frequent references to the books that were strewn about. Could it be possible that yonder absorbed man had once spoken passionately to me of love, and now he sat in light and warmth and indifference, almost within reach of my hand, while I, like an outcast, stood in cold and darkness and despair? Was there then no echo of my face coming between him and his studies? I had forfeited the right to sit beside him, reading the observations his pencils noted down, and chasing away the gloom that was deepening on his nature, and I had not the hope, which would have been really a hope and a consolation to me, that some other woman, more true and more worthy, would by and by own my forfeited right. I rang the bell. I heard the bell tinkle, and Martin rose and left the room. I wondered if I should have time to creep in and steal but one scrap of paper which had been thrown aside carelessly, but as I tremblingly held the handle of the glass door, he returned, bearing in his arms the emaciated form of little Lucy Fraser. He had wrapped her carefully in a large cloak, and now, as he wheeled a chair to the fire and placed her in it, every rigid lineament of his countenance was softened to tenderness. I stretched out my arms toward him with an intense yearning to be gathered again to his noble heart, and have his chill and darkness dissipated. I turned away with this last tender image of him graven on my memory, to retrace my steps to my desolate house. There was a sudden twittering in the ivy overhead, and a small bird pushed out of its nest into the cold night air, came fluttering down, and flew against the lighted panes. In an instant his dog, which had been uneasy in at my vicinity before, stood baying at the window, and I had only time to escape and hide myself among the shrubs when he opened it and stepped out onto the terrace. The dog tracked down the path by which I had come, barking joyfully as he careened along the open fields, and as Martin looked round, I cowered more closely into the deepest shadows. I knew he must find me, for my footmarks were plain upon the newly fallen snow, and an extravagant sensation of shame and gladness overpowered me. I saw him lose the footprints once or twice, but at last he was upon the right trace, and lifting the boughs beneath which had hidden, he found me among the laurels. I was crouching. He had stooped down curiously. "It is Stella," I said faintly. "Stella?" he echoed. He lifted me from the ground like a truant child, whom he had expected home every hour, carried me across the entrance into the library, and set me down in the light and warmth of his own hearth. One little kiss to the child, whose eyes beamed with a strange light upon us, and then, taking both my hands in his, he bent down and read my face. I met his gaze unshrinkingly, eye to eye. We sounded the depths of each other's heart in that long, unwavering look. Never more could there be doubt or mistrust, never again deception or misconstruction between us. Our star had risen, and full-orbed, rounded into perfection, shed a soft and brilliant light upon the years to come. Chime after chime, like the marriage peal of our souls, came the sound of distant bells across the snow and roused us from our reverie. "I thought I had lost you altogether," said Martin to me. "I believed you would come back to me somehow, at some time. But this evening I heard that you were gone, and I was telling Lucy Fraser so not long since. She had been pining to see you." Now he suffered me to take the child upon my lap, and she nestled closely to me with a weary sigh, resting her head upon my bosom. Just then we heard the carol singers coming up the avenue, and Martin drew the curtains aside the windows, before which they stationed themselves to sing the legend of the miraculous star in the east. When the singers ended and raised their cry of "We wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year," we went out into the porch to speak to them, and I hid my face in the child's curls and thanked God who had so changed me. "But what is it, Martin?" I cried in terror as I raised my head on his return. The child's downcast eyes were closely sealed, and her little firm hand had grown lax and nerveless. Insensible and breathless, she lay in my arms like a withering flower. "It is only fainting," said Martin. "She has been drooping ever since you left us, Stella, and my only hope of her recovery rests in your ministering care." All that night I sat with the little child resting on my bosom, revived for her from death-like swoon, and sleeping calmly in my arms because she was already beginning to share in the life and joy and brightness of my heart. There was perfect silence and tranquillity enclosing us in a blissful oasis, interrupted only by the entrance of my nurse, who had been found by Martin in a state of utmost perplexity and alarm. The happy Christmas morning dawned. I asked my nurse to arrange my hair in a style in which my mother used to wear hers, and when, after a long conversation with Susan, Mr. Fraser received me as his daughter with great emotion and affection, and oftener called me Maria than Stella, I was satisfied to be identified with my mother. Then, in the evening, sitting amongst them, a passion of trembling and weeping seized me, which could only be soothed by their fondest assurances. After which I sang them some old songs, with nothing in them but their simple melody, and Mr. Fraser talked freely of foremost years and of the times to come, and Lucy's eyes almost laughed. Then Martin took me home along the familiar path, which I had so often traversed alone and fearless, but the excess of gladness made me timid, and at every unusual sound I crept closer to him with a sweet sense of being protected. One sunny day in spring, with blithe Lucy and triumphant dictatress Barbara for my bridesmaids, I guess it's like a dictator, but female, I accepted, humbly and joyfully, the blessed lot of being Martin Fraser's wife, and even in the scenes of the empty-headed folly of my girlhood, I thence tried to be better, and to do my duty in love, gratitude, and devotion. Only at first Martin pretended not to believe that on that night I stole out to have a last glimpse, not of him, but of his father. I knowing nothing of the change that had transformed Mr. Fraser's sitting room into his own study. Alright, I know we still have 20 more minutes of time, but these chapters are very long, so rather than go way over, I'm going to go ahead and end story time here. Oh, let me get Maestro back up. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and end story time here. Do you guys think I should do a game stream? And, oh, yes, kitty treats times. Oh, thank you. Thank you for the hydration reminder. Yes, pants. I'm going to go find my stockings really quick. You too, Maestro. Come on. Come on up here, Snockings. Come here. Snockings, up here. Come on. Come on. Snockings. Come on up. There we go. Maestro, you too. Yeah. This is from Corel. The kitties thank you, and I thank you, Corel. So what do you guys think? Should I do a game stream now? Or should I end here and raid somebody? Stockings, that was all. It was just that. It was just those treats. Little beggar kitty. Well, let me see what we have here. I could do, let's see. Don't think there's been an update on Terraria. I wonder if there's any Christmas updates on anything. I could do the Dark Side Detective Santa Claus thing, but I want to wait a little while till it's not as fresh. Eyes of Ara might have a Christmas thing. Let me check. Let's see. Oh, we're gonna pause this. I have no clue if they have a Christmas event going on. But actually, I'm thinking, because my throat is a little tender at the moment. I had to run some errands, and the allergies have been especially bad because of all the wood fires that people are doing, even though it's in the 60s, so they shouldn't be doing wood stove fires. But let us see who's streaming right now. Oh, no, that wasn't what I meant to do. Let's see. We've got Jolty, we've got Curie, Honey Crossing, it's Twiggy. What is Twin Mirror? Psychological thriller adventure game. Ooh, that looks interesting. Let's go ahead and raid her. Alright. Well, thank you again for hanging out with me. Next stream is going to be on Wednesday, unless I hear otherwise. And then let me type my message.
There we go. All right, thank you once again, and I hope to see you guys next time. I hope you have a good rest of your day or night or whatever time of day it is. Bye.
Declan.